So
kicked, punched, spat at, urinated on, bottles chucked at me,
God.
my stuff trashed, attacked.
So, Sabrina, Dr. Sabrina Cohen-Hatton, thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode of The Royals. We've got you here to talk about a very special project that you've been working on with Prince William. And Kate and I have just hot-footed it across town, having seen a screening of the documentary, Prince William, Weakening and Homelessness.
This is the two-parter that's coming out this week, which features you, obviously, and it's on ITV, so everyone can watch it, and it's all about the Prince's Homewards initiative. And
one of the key things I think that people will really get a sense of in the documentary is how important it was to the Prince, that people with lived experience of homelessness are in the documentary, but also a very cool part of Homewards. So I think, will you just tell us a little bit about your background and your experience? And first of all, tell us what your job is now, because we've got slight envy. Girl crush envy.
I am a chief fire officer now. So
Give us your full title.
Run a fire brigade, chief fire officer of West Sussex Fire and Rescue Service.
Amazing.
Yeah, so it's a massive privilege for me to be in a public service position. I absolutely love it. I joined as a firefighter when I was 18, quite soon after my experience of homelessness, actually, and joined the fire service and went through my entire career from a firefighter, and I'm now a chief, so it's the highest rank that you can attain. And in fact, there are more chief fire officers called Chris than women chiefs. There's not very many of us.
I mean,
oh my goodness,
what a
you
stat.
have to change your name to Chris, and then it can be both.
Oh gosh, yeah. Could you imagine? There were more Johns at one point as well, but then one retired, so it skewed my stats.
But that path is extraordinary in and of itself, because you experienced homelessness, which is why you're involved with the Homewards initiative in the first place, and you've gone from that to win all sorts of accolades. You've written a book, you have a PhD. Tell us a bit about that journey. How did you end up homeless, and how did you get out of that situation?
Well, I have a backstory that is by no means unique to me. I grew up in a single-parent household after my dad died of a terminal illness. He had a brain tumour, and my mum really struggled to cope after his death, and she really suffered with her mental health. And we were living in an incredibly volatile environment. We had social services were back and forth all the time, and it was really tough growing up. We didn't have anything. My mum's business failed, and it was tough. She took it really badly. And one thing that I say repeatedly is that if somebody goes to war with their demons, it's everyone around them that gets hit by the shrapnel. And I think that when you talk about issues with mental health, it can absolutely feel like a war zone. And I know that that was the case for her. But by the time I was 15, nearly 16, it was just too much for me to be at home. And I ended up leaving home and sleeping rough on the streets of a town in South Wales called Newport, which is one of the Homewards locations. And it was really hard. It was really hard.
Tell us a bit about what that was like when you were living on the street, such a young age as well. What did you have to endure?
So I would sleep in shop doorways. I'd sleep in, there was a church at the end of a road called Commercial Street, and opposite like the police station. There was this big church there, and it was kind of derelict, and it had a porch that was open. So me and a couple of others that were also rough sleeping at the time, we'd kind of bed down there because it gave you a bit of shelter. We'd sleep in derelict buildings, anywhere where you had a bit of shelter, really. And it was horrible. People would, on a good day, they might walk past me like I wasn't even there. I felt like a ghost in some respects. You know, that everyone would just be going about their day, which is normal, and why shouldn't they go about their day? But you felt so isolated and so unseen, invisible almost. And
that was at best.
That was at best. So kicked, punched, spat at, urinated on, bottles chucked at me,
God.
My stuff trashed, attacked.
Oh. So one of the things I did on that point, if you're comfortable to talk about it, in the documentary there is a young woman, Lainey, who has had quite a rough journey as well, and she's in a hostel, hopefully on her way to finding secure, more permanent accommodation. And one of the things that she touches on, and her key worker mentions, is that it's, homelessness is hard for everyone. For women, it's especially hard. Yeah. And I wonder if you can speak to that at all.
Absolutely. There was an incredible vulnerability that I experienced that was something that I felt like I was living day to day, and you just couldn't shake it. Lainey says something in the documentary about asking people for money, and they say, yeah, but in exchange for sex. And she doesn't want to have sex with anybody. And that was an experience that I could absolutely relate to. Very often you would hope for a bed for the night, but it came with a cost.
Yeah.
And for me, it was a cost that I wasn't willing to bear. I often talk about my relationship with a dog that I had at that point in time. He was called Menace. He was a stray dog, and I was a stray girl. He was a bloody menace, but I loved him.
And he was your pal, your protector, was he?
Yeah, I mean, not a protector in the sense that he would, you know, physically protect me, but for me, I was completely socially and emotionally isolated. And he offered me that kind of relationship, that connection, that bond. And I know, looking back, I didn't appreciate it at the time, but looking back, I know that because I had that connection, I wasn't then seeking it somewhere else with someone that might have exploited my vulnerabilities. Right. There were lots of other women that I knew that were rough sleeping at the same time as me, or who were involved in that area. And you know, they'd ended up getting hooked on drugs, and then they ended up doing sex work to fund the habit. And it had started from a relationship with someone that they thought was a relationship, but actually it's someone that's looking to exploit them. And I look back and I think I'm so lucky that wasn't me. It could have been. It really could have been. But I really think that bond and that connection that I had with Menace was one of the things that protected me.
Oh, I love the sound of Menace. He sounds great. So it's interesting hearing you talking about homelessness, because a lot of people who don't know much about the subject might think that, okay, you don't have a home. But you're saying there was something else that was taken away from you, that it was a sense of self, that you were a ghost, that you lost that sense of self, which must be massively debilitating for your own sense of worth, self-esteem. How did you get out of that situation? Did you find somebody who was able to help you?
It was really difficult for me at the time because when I first started rough sleeping, I didn't want to go into care. I was terrified of going into care. And I think when you are raised in an environment where your caregiver loves you really deeply, but they don't have the psychological or the physical resources to care for you properly, you're raised to see any kind of authority through a lens of mistrust. So I didn't want to go into care. I didn't want anyone to know that I was experiencing homelessness. I didn't want to tell the school. I carried on going to school.
You carried on going to school while living on the street?
School.
Was it GCSEs?
GCSEs. I sat my GCSEs when I was rough sleeping. Yeah.
No, so you turned up for your exams.
Yeah. I sold the big issue to get enough money to buy those. Do you know those study guides, those student study guides? Because it was hit or miss where I could keep my books, and there was a derelict building that we were staying in at one point. When I say we, there were me and a couple of other people that were rough sleeping at the same time. We'd often find somewhere together, and my books were in a box there, and they got destroyed by one guy that was staying there at the same time, who took objection to the fact that I was Jewish. It was a really, really horrendous experience, and he tore up all my books and stuff. So then I left them in the big issue office, the ones that I did have left, but I didn't have anything to study with. So when I was studying the big issue, I was putting a bit aside, getting something to eat every day, and then bought these little study guides, and I studied for my GCSEs. I can remember sitting in a park just reading through these books, waiting for my GCSEs, and it was really difficult. But I was worried about people knowing, because I didn't trust authority. And
you didn't tell any of your teachers, and your friends didn't know?
But one teacher actually walked past me when I was selling the big issue and crossed the road.
Really? Wow. It's interesting hearing you say that. And actually, when you were talking earlier about how, dehumanizing, that people just walk past you, spit at you, or don't even respond to you. I mean, I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about how that felt, because one of the things that you have spoken about when we first met you a few months ago at a briefing, and one of the things William's been talking about for the past year is, as much as providing and producing more permanent, secure housing for people who are at risk of or experiencing homelessness, one of the things he's desperately keen to do is change the perceptions around homelessness, what it is, what it means, the unseen homelessness. But also, I remember I sat down with him last year and did an interview with him, and the key thing he was keen to get across was people's preconceptions of it. He said, you see someone on the street rough sleeping, you immediately jump to a preconception about how they've got there and why they're there, and maybe they do or don't want to help themselves. And I just wanted to ask you first of all, how that feels as someone who's experienced it, and secondly, how important you really do think changing the narrative around the issue is long term.
it's crucial. And I'll explain why it's crucial. When I was experiencing homelessness, it felt so isolating and I felt so dehumanized on many, many occasions. And whilst at the time that you're experiencing homelessness, you can kind of, someone had walked past me and they'd kick my stuff, or, they'd shout at me, or all kinds of stuff. And I can remember thinking to myself, do you know what? It's one person out of 7 billion in the world. Why should your opinion matter to me? You can rationalize that. You don't know me, you don't know anything about me. Why does it matter? But the reality is we're human beings and we're hardwired to absorb the way people respond to us as social information. It informs the way that we expect the next person to respond to us. Then it becomes how we speak to ourselves. It becomes our inner narrative, that little voice inside our head that tells us where we are in relation to the rest of the world. And so when you're experiencing homelessness, it's not just that you don't have a roof over your head. You have no stability. You have no secure base on which you can go and explore or take a risk or grow yourself or be better than you are today to try to do something even better tomorrow. You have none of that. Your headspace is completely consumed with an attempt to try to survive. And when you have then these experiences that are happening around you that tell you you have no value, you have no sense of worth, it's that you carry with you. And so for me, and this is one of the things that I've spoken to the Prince about, it's not just about getting a roof over your head and having stability. There is a recovery from homelessness. And the recovery is about how you see yourself in relation to the rest of the world and convincing yourself, starting to believe that you do have value and worth in comparison to it. And I didn't tell anyone about my homelessness for more than 20 years because I felt this stigma.
There's such a there is still such a stigma around it.
Massively.
And how old are you now?
41.
So you've kept that secret for a long time.
I kept it a secret for a very long time.
Now you're coming out. It's interesting that you're a firefighter as well, I think, because you're there to kind of protect lots of things, but that kind of building and that sense of self. One thing that the Homewards is quite keen to promote as well is this idea of the kind of multi-agency, and it sounds very kind of corporate speak.
Wraparound services.
Yeah, this idea that let's look at how schools can intervene. Let's look at how all these different agencies can kind of talk to one another, from the police, the firefighters, and all that sort of stuff. How did you get out of your situation? I've got, an image of young Sabrina in my mind going to school and having this kind of strange life outside of school where you're homeless and you've had to grow up quickly, whereas all your friends and peers are going home to a meal and a warm bed. How do you get from that to build up to be what you are today, which is this really impressive and awe-inspiring individual with all these kind of accolades?
Well, I actually sold the Big Issue. And the Big Issue is amazing because it's something that as a vendor you buy for cost price and then you sell on for a profit. So every Big Issue vendor that you see is actually a micro entrepreneur. They're running their own mini business in a way. And that enabled me, I think, to have some agency, which is something I severely lacked in the beginning when I was experiencing homelessness. And it gave me some self-esteem and something to focus on. And it took a while, but eventually I was able to save up enough to get into accommodation. There were a few false starts. I had a room in a shared house initially, and I got attacked by someone else living there. And he put me in the hospital, and I didn't feel safe there after that, so I went back out. And then I had a little bed sit, but I felt awful that other people that I knew were still sleeping out, so I'd let them sleep over, and they'd be doing drugs, and they'd trash the place, and I wouldn't have been a very good tenant when I look back. And so I'd be back out again, and then I stayed in a van for a while. And that was a bit more secure. But eventually, I was able to save up enough to put down a deposit on a very cheap rented flat away from the city centre, away from people that I knew, where I felt like I could have a fresh start. And that was the beginning. And Menace, my little dog, was he was the thing that transitioned with me, and I think kept me grounded. He was my kind of secure attachment, if you like, during that period. And it was then when secure accommodation started to become a reality, I started to think about what else could become a reality, and that's when I started to think about the fire service.
Why the fire service?
Oh, it's such a privilege because you're trusted by people to know what to do, and they're having the worst day they've ever had. And they trust you to come in, and if you can, make it better, but at the very least, stop it from getting any worse. And I think, in a way, I wanted to help people in a way that no one had been able to help me. So look, I know the context is completely different, but I think the sentiment is the same, and that attracted me to it. And it's funny, because when I started to say to people, do you know what, I'm thinking of being a firefighter, they'd all laugh and they'd be like, oh my God, Sabrina, you're too small, you're going to get in the way, give it up. And I think that spurred me on more.
Knowing you a little bit now, I realise that's the sort of thing that you think, okay, come on, bring it. But what we see you doing in this programme is actually kind of firefighting in a different way, because you're going to people who are on the streets and people who help them. And we see you talking to a man who's lived in a tent for 8 years and sells the big issue and the issues that he's had. And it transpires, spoiler alert, that he's one of the reasons he moved out of home was that he had this terrible fire that sadly killed his mother. And again, speaks to your qualifications as a firefighter. But then another guy who's got this great success story that went from a kind of 7 stone drug addict on the street to work himself up to now be in his own place, Wayne, in the programme, and he's now reconnected with his daughter, and you took him to the palace. So you're actually doing a lot of work in the programme on behalf of the prince. You go out and meet these people for him, because it's hard for him to kind of walk around unnoticed, I suppose. How did those conversations come about with the prince, where he said, look, can you go and do some of this research?
First of all, it was an incredible honour for me to be asked to become an advocate for Homewards. But one of the things that was really important to me in advocacy is not to just be a figurehead or a name on a piece of paper, but to actually go out and do something that can contribute to solving the experience that I and so many other people have. There are so many different facets of homelessness, which I think the documentary does a great job at shining a light on, that people don't even associate with homelessness, the hidden homelessness. But my experience of street homelessness is being written off. And the demographic of both Wayne and Vincent, they're older gentlemen over the age of 50, seen as entrenched rough sleepers, mental injuries, they've got physical injuries, drug addictions, huge support needs. So actually transitioning from a life of experiencing homelessness to a life where you are not just in secure accommodation, but thinking about the contribution that you can make to society, your place within the world, the value that you have and that you give yourself, is a really tough journey. And what I will say is, when I was rough sleeping, some of the people who showed me the most compassion and really looked out for me and actually genuinely cared and in some respects helped to keep me safe from some of the other vulnerabilities that I was exposed to, were people of exactly that demographic. Entrenched rough sleepers that everybody had written off. The people that others were avoiding because they were sat there taking drugs and cooking up heroin on the side of the street. People would understandably go, well, I'm going to walk over there. But they were kind, they were thoughtful. They had, for me, I'm thinking of one person in particular, and I won't say his name because he'll have surviving family, but he really stopped some horrible things from happening to me, and I will forever love him for what he did. He's dead now, sadly, but when I look at that demographic of people and I see how I saw myself as having no worth and no value, and I've gone on to a career in public service, I've literally been privileged enough to be trusted to save people's lives. I've done a PhD, I've done research that's changed the way that we deal with fires, so I like to think I've been able to put something back into the world, but I was written off in the same way. And so what was important to me about this documentary was not just to go out on behalf of the Prince and find things that work, but really find things that work, that really demonstrate to people that you shouldn't write others off. Your situation that you're in doesn't determine where you end up, it's just the position that you start from. And I think seeing both, Vincent's journey, and he was an electrician, he had a family, he had a normal life, and he had a fire.
This is the guy who did the electrics on the Millennium Stadium.
Yeah. He never recovered from losing his mother in a fire. And he finds it incredibly difficult to sleep inside a house now because of his experience.
It comes back to William's, other great passion for mental health, doesn't it? The fact that he's looking at all these different elements of the mental health aspect that wasn't prevented, then you end up to this other, this other problem, and end up there. That meeting at Windsor Castle on the programme looked very emotional. Can you tell us about how that went, what that day was like?
It was incredible. So we took Wayne, who had experienced homelessness. He was the one who was 7 stone, taking drugs, entrenched rough sleeping. And he's now living in his own house. He has kicked his drug habit completely, and his next step is to give up alcohol completely, and he's almost there.
He looked quite tearful when he met the prince.
He was. He's got some really severe health problems exacerbated by his experience.
And he talked about the feeling of people writing him off through until, you know, the woman that found him on the street and literally wrapped him in a blanket and put him in her car, Gemma, took him to hospital. He said he got very emotional. So he was saying to William, you know, people have written me off, and, you know, thank you for not writing me off. For people who don't know and aren't experts on Homewards and haven't seen the documentary yet, just in a nutshell, what is Homewards trying to do? You're an advocate. What is the project trying to do?
The aim of Homewards is to try to make homelessness rare, brief and unrepeated. And if we can end hopelessness within the 5-year programme, or at least demonstrate that it is possible, then that would be the aims achieved. So Homewards has got 6 key locations, 6 target locations, and the idea is to build examples of how it could work that can then be scaled up and built on and done elsewhere as well. And it looks to examples where it has worked previously, and in the documentary you'll hear them talking about the Finland model, and Finland have done some
first.
They've done some incredible work.
They've halved homelessness, it said in the in the programme.
It is awesome. So it is possible, and I think what Homewards does is not just shine a light on the problem, but it looks at getting all of the people around the table that we need around the table to help to end homelessness and gets them talking to each other. We can't underestimate the convening power that the Prince has, and I feel so fortunate that he has chosen a topic such as homelessness to really shine a light on.
Well, it was interesting seeing him in some of those behind the scenes
he
meetings
really
in the documentary, where you see him bringing private landlords to the table in Sheffield, and then afterwards, you know, him talking about pulling some levers, but he'll pull the levers he can, and then afterwards some of those landlords do give up more of their private rental accommodation for people who are experiencing or at risk of homelessness, which they would have been nervous to have done before.
Absolutely.
So, and I think that's the other thing he talks about, and you see in the documentary, is getting all the different like practical partners on board. So you have Lainey, the young woman who's, you know, now in a hostel looking
she's
for
great, isn't she?
more. She's fantastic.
She's got a cat, like you had your dog.
I love her.
But she's you see her starting the job
connection.
in Pret a Manger, who are coming on board and, you know, providing or helping to provide jobs for people who otherwise would have found it very hard. Because I remember when we first met you at the Homewards briefing, one of the things you said was before you found that route out, it was really hard to know who to talk to and who to ask for help. Yeah. And you do slightly feel like the people whose journeys we see in the documentary, I just feel like they've been very lucky to find the one person who sees them on the street. It just feels like that isn't there yet. That sort of, a lot of people just don't know what to do and aren't going to be found by a Gemma or, you know, a Sophie.
And part of it is resourcing, actually, because it's really, really difficult. You know, we all know what the economic situation is like, and having the resources that you need to solve a problem is always really challenging. And what I love about Homewards is it's taking everything that's there already and encouraging us all to look at it in a different way. It's not focused on what the problems are and what we can't do. It's really putting a laser focus on what we can do. And that means inevitably doing things differently.
There's a point where you look quite excited. You come out of meeting somebody who's had changed their life around, and you're kind of going, yeah, let's do this elsewhere. Let's kind of get on board, which is exactly the sort of message that William is giving throughout this sort of 2-parter documentary, isn't it? That he's sort of trying to say, well, look, we need hope, we need optimism. It's always this kind of upbeat, like, yes, there's a problem, but we can make it better if we just kind of believe, and that sort of thing. So it seems like you and the Prince are on. Was it good working with him? This has been going on. This has been filmed for quite over a long period of time, sort of 18 months or so, hasn't it?
Yeah, and it covered the
through quite a difficult time for the Prince, of course, that he persisted with this project and the television project when it might have been easier just to bin off the documentary.
Absolutely, and I think really that's testament to his commitment to really challenging what we think about when we're talking about homelessness and really helping to try to solve the challenges that are contributing to homelessness. He's really committed, and one thing that I've taken from working with him is how invested he is. He really appreciates the human side of the story. And I think for me that's an incredible quality of leadership that I, for one, feel really fortunate to have a monarch that is doing that. You know, it's wonderful. So I'm, you know, I think it's been fantastic to be involved with, and I am really, really taken by his perspective on it and his belief in driving it forward.
One of the interesting things about the documentary, I think, that people will be it's the question that always comes up.
I was going to say, it's the criticism.
It's the question you have to ask him when you talk to him about it. I did, other people did, the documentary maker does. You hear LBC questioning it in one of the clips. Is he's someone who has a very privileged background, which he acknowledges. He has access to many homes, and the question is, well, how could you begin to understand homelessness when all these things?
He answers the critics, doesn't he? In the program, he says, if I think if I answered every critic, I'd be here all day. And then he says, I think criticism drives you forward. He can't fail in this project because he knows there's criticism.
I think the other thing that's interesting is how important do you think it is for someone like him? He's clearly very keen to see private landowners like himself,
and he's leading from the front on that.
How important is it to see someone like him do something like Nan Sledden, the social housing project in Cornwall? It's just going to be, I think, 24 new homes. But the key thing is St Petrock's there, the charity, and the wraparound services there. What does it mean to have someone like him, as other people say, leading from the front and sort of putting his hand in his pocket himself?
I think it's a really, really good example of what can be done. And I've heard the criticism, and my argument is always, well, would you prefer to have a monarch that sits in a palace and enjoys his privilege, or would you prefer to have a monarch that is using his position to drive forward change and social change and making a difference for people? And I certainly know which one I'd prefer. And at what point are you too privileged to want to be able to push a social change forwards? Does it depend on your tax bracket? Do you have to have a certain amount of experience to do it? What qualifies you? So I hear the cynicism and I hear the criticism, but it doesn't really hold anything for me.
It's also clearly for him, as we've always known, given that Centrepoint was his first patronage, that his mother, was patron of the homelessness charity.
He talks a lot about his mother, doesn't he, in the documentary?
It's really real for him.
And when you get a sense that it really drives him.
Yeah, it's sort of. I think it's more than just kind of, am I someone in a privileged position who's not going to do anything? It's something that he's been exposed to from a very young age.
Absolutely.
And feels very strongly about.
And actually, it's really lovely seeing that come through in the documentary. And I think equally, when you think about the work that he does and the advocacy that he does, you can see how influenced he's been from his father's work as well, particularly when you look at Earthshot and the environmental work as well.
And Nan Sledden and the Duchy, the work that Charles started there.
And if you think about Charles's early work around environmentalism, he was really ahead of his time, and he was met with great cynicism. And now the idea that we would be cynical about environmental issues, we'd all kind of look at each other and go, well, no, it's really obvious. But it wasn't back then. So you can see, I think, how Prince William has really taken those influences from both his mother and his father to stand tall and continue to progress with things that he believes in, that he knows can make a difference, because he knows it's the right thing to do. And
he keeps talking.
Will come, it's fine, but you carry on pushing on.
Yeah, he talks about his platform, doesn't he? And he's very. I think Mick talked about this afterwards in the Q&A after we saw the screening, that he likes the documentary because it's a way for everybody else to see the kind of behind the scenes William, that obviously you get to see, Sabrina, that Mick from the Passage gets to see.
There's a great scene of him helping to serve Christmas dinner at the Passage, being bossed about by the cook, by Claudette in the kitchen, who just goes, "Come on, William, clear the plates, chop." And you sort of see him.
She ticks him off, doesn't he, to go and have a chat when he should be working.
Clearly got a bond with a lot of people there who, over a long period of time, because he does a lot of private visits that we don't know about, don't see, we aren't on the rota for.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to Mick about that last year. He's like, he comes here more than, a lot, more than any of you know. And I think what's interesting is, to have that, to be in that position, and when he goes into, the Passage, or whether it's Centrepoint or anything else, people there just feel they can talk to him quite freely. And you talked about it in the documentary. Perhaps he's able to have that empathy because he's had his own trauma in life, and you've experienced trauma, he has.
I thought that was a good point you made, Sabrina, in the thing that people probably don't realise it, or they think it's historic. But just tell us what you were talking about before, because that was a really interesting kind of joining up the dots of why Prince William is as he is.
Yeah, because you don't have to have experienced homelessness to be able to appreciate some of the factors that have contributed to homelessness. And when you look at people's experiences, more often than not, there's trauma involved, whether it was a trauma that led to their experience of homelessness or the trauma of experiencing it at the time. And I think although Prince William hasn't experienced being homeless. What he has experienced is trauma. He's a human, and he's experienced that human pain of a traumatic loss.
Losing his mother at 15.
Yeah, so I really think that it enables him to empathise in a way that people might not immediately think.
I remember talking to Shay O'Bacon from Centrepoint last year, and he slept rough with William. When William
under a
did
bridge.
that,
Yeah.
did that, got a lot
He
of
did a
attention.
night under a bridge.
Did a night under a bridge in London. It was cold. He just did one night. I remember talking to Shay last year, and he said they woke up in the morning, and William was very, very quiet, and they walked together for a long time. Just rolled up the sleeping bags and walked. And he said one of the things that William said to me was, that yes, it had been very challenging, very hard, and he just thought, this was a long time ago, and William was long before William started his official sort of mental health work. He said, I really worry about, young people who have to do that day in, day out, how they must feel, how it must make them feel, how it must affect their mental health. So even then he was sort of thinking about, it wasn't just about sleeping rough, it was about much more than that. It was about the wider impact. But it's the catchphrases for Homewards are to make homelessness brief, rare and unrepeated. But, he's come out very punchy, and he says, we shouldn't be living with it. I don't think we should be living with homelessness. The documentary is called Prince William, We Can End Homelessness. Yeah. It's a very positive, lofty ambition.
Well, he even says about his mother, doesn't he? Saying that
she'd think I was mad.
She'd think I've been mad to start Homewards.
Is it realistic, do you think? Can homelessness be ended in 5 years?
Why not? Why not? I mean, from my perspective, if we put enough focus on it and we get enough of the right people around the table and really focus on breaking the cycle and working on prevention, then I think my argument is why not? And why wouldn't that be what we'd aspire to? Mm-hmm. Surely one person rough sleeping should be too many. So why wouldn't we say the ambition is to end homelessness and not stop striving until we've met that ambition?
What do you want people to take away from watching the documentary? If there was one or two things that you hope it will sort of focus people's minds on, what is it?
I really hope that it helps to take away the stigma from experiencing homelessness. There are many forms of homelessness, not just street rough sleeping, but we heard a lot about the hidden homelessness and the temporary accommodation.
The sofa surfing.
Yeah. And lots of people that might not consider themselves to be experiencing homelessness actually are when you look at the circumstances surrounding it. So I think for me, if there's one thing that I would love people to take away from watching the documentary, it's to change the way that they think about homelessness, to help to eradicate that stigma so that the journey, the recovery from homelessness, in whatever form it is, will be that bit easier for the people that are going through it. Because there, by the grace of God, go any of us.
I can see why Prince William is such a fan of yours, Sabrina. You speak so movingly and passionately, and it's a real inspiration to hear you talk about what is ultimately a very complex subject, but you just bring all the threads together so neatly and really kind of illuminate it for us.
Thank you so much for joining us. Will you come back and talk to us again?
My pleasure.
We'd love to have
maybe
you
in
again,
5 years'
anytime.
time when
we've
you have
sooner.
ended homelessness.
Absolutely.
And not sooner.
Honestly, thank you for helping us to shine a light on it, because we couldn't do it without you guys as well, and we appreciate it. So thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
You too.
Nice to meet you.